I'm delighted to be chairing the session today. This first session, to me, is a very interesting one. I'll let you into a secret. I do a lot of accreditations for the Institute, for the Learning Performance Institute. And one of the things that I always look for is what they're doing around competencies and talent management. And I can tell you that of what I see is going on, something like 70 to 75% of what I see happening out there isn't quite right. So the probability of absolutely not getting something quite right in this area is high. To be able to hear from and talk to an expert that's actually got it right, I think is a privilege. And on that note, I'm delighted to introduce Jane Gardner. Jane is a talent development manager at Taylor Francis Group. Jane, thank you.
If I can start off by setting the scene for you and giving you a bit of background. Taylor Francis is an academic and professional publishing business. And the main business really is divided into two key areas of books and journals, and they're structured in the same kind of ways, but the business models they're dealing with are very different. If we roll back the clock to about 2006, we didn't really have a very strong culture of performance management. We didn't have a strong culture of learning development either. There's a really strong desire for everybody to get a lot of training, but that wasn't obviously the same thing. We had a lot of paternalistic type of culture and nurturing, and it was a growing, successful business. So it was growing from about 300 to 350 million between 2006 to 11. And into this kind of situation and culture came a competency framework from our parent company. And it had to be rolled out and implemented in a very short amount of time, which we did, and we did that across the business. But the accountability headings had been set for us, the role profiles, that kind of template, that was created for us as well, and the competencies existed. When we were given guidelines how we should roll this out to the business, so we had some focus groups. The people attending the focus groups were nominated from the business to take part, and they discussed the tasks. They looked at how that fitted in with accountability headings and how that might link in with some of those skills and behaviours. But of course, those outcomes, those structures have already been created. So although we're discussing those, they weren't influencing those competencies that they came up with. There are always a lot of objections and obstacles when you're talking about competencies with people. And we were talking to the people in those focus groups, and obviously the directors, the managers, the rest of the staff, about the benefits that you all know that you would get from putting in a competency framework. So obviously we were talking about the structure, about giving feedback and appraisals, about the benefits of them having a professional approach to recruitment, and so on. We're encouraging them to link them to objectives. We're also emphasising the fact that, obviously, we'd been talking previously about just what people did, but we weren't really emphasising, well, actually, it's the how they do it that is really going to make the difference, and quite often is what makes somebody successful. It was really important for us as well that they really got the idea of it being a consistent approach across the whole business. We've got these two areas, books and journals. They feel separate. In some ways, they still want to be separate. But actually, we wanted staff to be able to move across the business, to also see, well, what opportunities are there for me in the business if I'm in the wrong role and I want to move? Are there other opportunities for me? And hopefully they would then move around the business rather than moving out of the business. We did actually make those role requirements, the profiles and competencies, available to every staff member on the learning management system, so they could actually have a look and see if they had transferable skills, or just to see what happened in other roles. So the framework was in place, it was in use, it was being used for appraisals, but we knew that a lot of people were just using it as a tick box exercise. They were doing what they had to do as the minimum to be able to press the button. So looking back, probably now, I'd say really that was our pilot. And we've learnt a lot since doing that, and we've made changes to the way that we've done it. We had been obviously selling the benefits, but we really needed to strengthen the link between the benefits and the business benefits. Our CEO was supportive, but we really had to get the operating board members to really buy into it and actually see it as something that's of value. So over the next few years, really, we started then relaunching our competency frameworks to the business, but this time gradually. An example of how we did that was our staff turnover in one part of the business had shot up, and we knew we needed to look at it and understand what was going on. In that area, they were losing people who should be staying with the business and helping us grow our product, our revenue, current and future. So we looked at the exit survey data, and some of that was telling us in key areas around performance management, around feedback. People felt they had perhaps a lack of development. Some people thought that across their department, even with the work we'd done previously, they're still getting patchy appraisals. And also they didn't feel they had a career plan. They really wanted to have a clear path. They knew where they were headed. So there's a business problem there, and competencies could help them actually address that. So now the directors were far more keen to listen to some of the benefits that actually the competencies could help them deliver. So what we did is we created some career paths, starting off with one particular department. Their graduates didn't want to stay in their role for 3 years, learning the ropes, learning the job, developing, and waiting for this extra role or this new vacancy to come up. They wanted to progress quickly. They wanted to know how to do it. The structure didn't really support that. So what we did is we created additional roles to bridge that gap. We really worked with them to unpick the roles and understand what the requirements were and the competencies, and look at the next role and try and bridge that gap with competencies. Tasks as well, but really emphasising that someone can then drive their development forwards. They've got that path and that power's in their hands. It gave people a clear framework so they actually could see how they can progress on merit or how they can show that they're a really good candidate for the next promotion. It had to be done consistently. It was obviously key across a department, but also it meant that they could get consistent feedback as well. We used other opportunities as well to be able to latch on to linking in competencies. One of those was the employee survey. We did an employee opinion survey for the first time. We got a really good response rate, about 80%. But obviously there were areas that were coming out of that that the business thought, the staff thought should be strengthened. That was another opportunity to be able to draw competencies into the mix. Not surprising, they thought there should be greater cooperation between the books and journals areas or between other teams. So areas where we could draw out of that survey, we then strengthened our competency framework. It was being used, their feedback was being incorporated into the competency framework. If there were change projects that were going on in the business, again, is that an opportunity to be able to link that into the competencies? In another department, they wanted to alter the roles across the department, build in more progression, perhaps change the focus, and give the staff there a really good foundation to start slowly building up those skills. What we did there was we unpicked those roles yet again, but this time we actually looked through all of the competencies as well, and we restructured them. We used different accountability headings, not the ones we'd been given. We strengthened the competency framework and added in any new skills that they needed for a new skill set, and worked with them on creating a new functional competency set for them. And this was one of the career paths that we then created from that as an example, where we're bridging that gap in that department between that marketing coordinator role, for example, and the marketing executive, so they could actually see that there was a path for them. And we did that in a few different departments. Those directors that we've been working with on those change projects or other issues that we were linking in with competencies became champions. They told other people about it. They brought on not just their own departments, but other operating board members who wanted the same thing for their areas and were coming to us saying, what can you do for us? We'd like a similar kind of approach. There are other people in the business who have been giving us feedback about competencies. Not positive, but they're giving us feedback And we're incorporating their changes as well and listening to them and talking to them about how we could improve things and incorporate that feedback. And then they became more champions as well because they were then supportive of the whole idea and of the scheme. That really became our new model of implementing competencies, because as business areas wanted to be able to redefine roles or have other change projects like that, we rebuilt their functional competencies with them. So then they felt ownership of them. So why wouldn't they want to use and believe in something that they'd had a hand in creating? So we're tailoring the content. We're tailoring it and updating it to fit our business. Whereas previously, there wasn't that involvement. And the next step for us really is also tailoring the method of assessment. That's also got to fit your business. Whether a rating is right for you, whether it's the words, the terminology has got to fit your business. The terminology wasn't right for us, and that's something that's being changed. Now, originally, I knew that I wanted to be able to link competencies in more strongly to recruitment and also to performance management. But there's no way we could have done that initially, and it had to be done incrementally. We want to provide managers with a really good toolkit to support them. So they've got a really strong basis now for actually doing competency-based interview questions and having a more professional approach to their interviewing, which is good for the candidates, but also gives them much better structure for giving feedback, especially when it's also going to be to internal candidates. We're probably in the early stages of fully linking that into our recruitment process and giving them a nice question bank, but certainly people are using it. We've had good feedback from recruiting managers, whether they're an operating board member or whether they're a first-line manager. It's also been a useful toolkit as well for performance management. It's something we want to encourage managers to do more, to nip situations in the bud rather than tackle them later, which is what they had been doing. So I actually wrote some additional competencies to support common performance management problems and put those into our competency framework. So then managers really felt they had the support there to help them tackle and have those conversations. They had those hooks and they could see that. That was obviously incorporated then into workshops and training around that. So we now had a consistent framework for assessing performance. The roles were then clearly defined, so also the expectations were clearer. We've got a really good tool now to measure ability that we didn't have before. We've also incorporated competencies when we've done 360 reviews. We've made sure there's a link there and they're all part of the same process. And the learning options that we offer to staff, whether it's e-learning or help sheets, workshops, they're available on our learning management system, but they're structured around, the majority of them, around the competencies. So there again, everything we're trying to do is emphasising the link between the competencies, between people being able to drive their own development as well. And I've got consistent down there. It's, it's something we're trying to drive across the whole business, is that they need to be consistent. They need to give feedback consistently, operate these schemes consistently, but hopefully also be consistent across those different business areas in a wider situation. Well, it's been quite a journey, really. It's taken several years to get to where we're at now. But we did start, I would recommend starting with the business drivers and the benefits. Any hooks that you've got in the business that you can use that are going to be able to support the business by employing competencies or having that link is going to get them far more engaged with the process. But it's also got to fit your business. There seem to be so many different ways of doing competencies, different frameworks, different ways of structuring them and assessing them. But it has to fit your business, be right for your culture. But also, from my experience, your business has got to be ready for it as well. When we first implemented it, it wasn't. It's also got to be a process of evolution, I would say. Don't try and do the whole thing at once. Pilot it, yes, but do it in stages if you can. And if somebody wants you to implement it very quickly, do try and push back if you can. Champions have been key for us, but we didn't go out searching for champions and selecting them. there were people that we were working on projects because we knew the business, we knew who might make a good champion, and they certainly helped us. And we involved them, and they supported us in that. I think the main thing I've learned from all of these implementing competencies is the involvement of the whole business in what you're doing to get their buy-in, but also the fact that it really is going to take quite a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Jane. We're going to open it up for questions. Jane's been very generous to us and allowed us some extra time, so we can be creative and interesting. I'm going to control it from here. I've already got 3 hands up, so I've got you in schedule, and I'm starting naturally with a lady.
Oh, thank you, Alan. I was really interested in the point you made about the question bank, because you seem to imply that you were making that very obvious, very available to people so they could sort of self-test before an interview. Did I get the right interpretation, or tell me a little bit more about how it works?
No, the question bank was the recruitment officer was coming up with a whole bank of questions that recruiting managers could then use, structured around competencies, to encourage them to use them in the interview setting and then to be able to give the feedback against them. So the information that was available to the staff was more the role requirements, which is available on the LMS or on different networks, so that anyone can see what the requirements of a role are in any department. So that's the bit that's very visible to everybody.
Are people able to test against it before
No.
they go for an interview?
They aren't.
The question was, can people test against it before they go to an interview? Sorry.
They can't. It's not structured in that way, but they could. I mean, they could have a look at the role profile, because all the role profiles have the accountability headings. They've got all the competencies on there and the levels that are required. There's a separate competency guide that lists all the indicators that are required. So then they could use that as the basis to say, well, yes, I can give evidence against these elements. These are the elements that I feel I need to develop. So in that way, they could test them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did you consider during the development phase the possibility of vocational qualifications arising from newly acquired skills and competencies?
So I didn't hear which qualification?
Vocational qualifications arising from their competency in the particular job that they're doing, or new jobs or new roles, you know, in terms of national vocational qualifications.
We didn't, because the majority of our business were graduates with a first or second degree. But one of the elements that people are very keen on that we could link in was more professional qualifications. So whether it's a CIM qualification or something like that. So for our business, that's something that people did really want to be able to do, was apply for a professional qualification of that kind and be able to put that into practice. That was the key thing we're wanting people to see, is that it's not just by going on a course or doing a few things. They need to demonstrate all of these things on a consistent basis, and that's something we're trying to emphasize.
Something here, so excuse me one moment.
I think you mentioned that you'd done sort of role-based competencies. Did you include leadership and behavioural competencies as well? And the second question, did you rely on the individual self-assessing against your competency framework, and was that endorsed or cross-checked by line managers or L&D?
I think the first part of that question was about the management and leadership competencies. That was part of the original framework. There were managing developing people, managing resources, managing strategy competencies. So the managerial roles had that as part of obviously what was in their role profile. But also we took that back a step and said, well, how does someone start? So that was part of when we looked at the career paths. When does someone start managing people? If they're not there and they don't have the opportunity to, what should they be starting to do and demonstrate? So we actually took some elements of that for some of the initial roles as well and built that in when they were perhaps a supervisory level, or if they're just delegating tasks, so that people were encouraged to, well, you can start here, start demonstrating those skills, even though you're not yet a line manager. And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
It was behaviours and also about endorsement or checking self-assessment.
On the learning management system, the competencies are all pulled onto people's review forms. So they assess them on the review form as part of the appraisal, put in the commentary about the different competencies that they want to comment on, whether it's strengths or areas they want to develop. But then the next important part is obviously that face-to-face meeting, so that still happens. And if the manager has a difference of opinion, then that's where they'd record a change there and say, well, actually, this is why I think you're not quite there. And they can then discuss that as part of the development plan as to how they can actually increase their involvement there.
Who's next? Here we go. Very interesting. 2 questions this side, 2 questions this side.
We are in the process now of designing a leadership development framework for our company. So what's the best practice to do so?
It's best process? Practice to do so. Well, I was starting off initially with a framework that we'd been given. So in some ways, my job might be easier or actually more difficult. So I think it's unpicking some of those elements, I would say, in terms of, was it a leadership and development program, did you say? Developing competency. Would you mind repeating the question again?
So you know, after designing the leadership development framework, we need to design a program that suit that development framework, the competencies. So how can we choose the programs suitable for these competencies, for the leadership competencies?
So it's fitting the training courses to link, and the programs and development options to link in with the competencies. Yes. I think it goes back to thinking about what you want to achieve. So where we've drawn them into the 360-degree appraisal scheme, for example, there's what are those outcomes? Where does that level of manager need to develop? There will be competency hooks there for you to then link into future leadership programs. Perhaps a lot of things might be about managing change, perhaps, or what are the external business drivers, I would say, that those leaders have to deal with? Is it about creativity and innovation, or is it the commercial results? And if you've got those hooks in your competency framework, then you can easily then structure the courses or the other development interventions to link in with those. But I think the external environment, especially for the leadership areas, is very important.
I'm coming around to you, sir. Thank you.
Hi, Jane. It sounds like you went through an iterative developmental process on the overall cycle. When did you decide that you were ready for that first pilot? In other words, did it require you to have development solutions in place for a complete list of competencies, or was that also kind of an iterative process? In other words, were you adding to the competencies and adding development solutions as you went, or did you even have a firm view when you started? How kind of organic was that process?
Okay. What ended up, as I called it, as the original pilot, was originally our first rollout. And that was done in a short amount of time. It wasn't an option, it was something that at the beginning of, I think, 2006, we had to roll it out. There it is, that's the scheme, it needs to operate. And we've got all these tools and guidelines on how to roll it out. So that really wasn't the way that we wanted to be able to roll it out at all. It was after that point that then it became more of an iterative process where we then worked with the business and unpicked the different competencies and recreated them, and then started linking in those development options. So as we worked with each business unit, really, that was where it became easier to link in some of those development options, especially when we are perhaps putting a scheme in place and then we say, well, we need to be able to get the managers to operate this effectively. Perhaps it was developing potential and coaching courses, for example, was one element that we linked in when we created those first career paths, because we knew for it to operate successfully, the managers had to be equipped to be able to deliver that and to give that effective feedback as well. So it wasn't something when we first rolled it out that we were doing, and it's something now that we're starting to pull in. But initially we did structure all of the workshops and courses on the LMS around some of those competency groupings, because it felt like that was going to be the best way forward for people to find the information to support their competencies.
Thank you. Who's next? I'm coming around. God, I lose weight on this exercise.
This might be a very operational level question, we are on the brink of doing something very similar to what you have done, and one of the things we've been required to do, been asked to do, is to make the system paperless. We at present love our paper and we've got far too much of it. Without going into the very nitty-gritty details, do your managers sit and do the appraisals in front of a PC, typing as they go, putting the scores in as they go, or is it written down first, photocopied, scanned? How paperless can you be?
The answer to that is some people do sit down with a laptop, but that's not what we would recommend as best practice. We say, because the individual on the learning management system, they have to do their own self-appraisal first. So they then send it on to their manager to have a look at, so they can do their preparation before the meeting. So at that point, they don't need to have a photocopy of it. They can have a look at it on screen. But most managers do print it out so that they've got a copy, and the staff members probably do as well. So they can sit there, they can scribble their own notes in the meeting. Because some managers do sit there with a laptop, but I think you miss out on having that dialogue and really making it a face-to-face meeting. And when we launched it, we really tried to emphasize the fact this system is just a system. It doesn't detract from the quality of the meeting or the fact that the face-to-face meeting is the most important part of it, even though it's now on an online system. So it's paperless to some extent. It's cut it down, but people do all print out their review forms.
Okay, one more. We might have time for a second one. We'll see how we go, but we've certainly got time for this one.
Do you have a return on impact or investment strategy in relation to the time, resource, money that was put into putting this framework together?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Do you have a return on impact or investment strategy for your competency framework?
Sorry, I still didn't get the first part of the question. I'm very sorry.
Well, yeah, I think the essence of it is, where's the business benefit of it? Yeah, and how do you capture that business benefit? How do you assess it? Yeah. Is that fair?
Yes. In some ways, we're not a business that does an awful lot of the calculations of ROI. We're talking, they tend to focus more on the business benefits and sometimes it will be their gut feeling, but we're working with them more on the evidence for these kind of things. Quite often we're linking it into projects that they're working on, so they're coming up with those business benefits and how they want it to evolve. So for example, I gave an example of part of the business that had high staff turnover. Well, that business was higher than the rest of the business at staff turnover. Now it's lower than the rest of the business. So we have got some metrics like that, but because it's being employed over such a long period of time, it's difficult to tie in everything to saying, well, this is what the business result has been, just only purely competencies.
I think this is an interesting one, and I'm sure we could go on further about it. I think the key, I think, isn't it, Jane, is what you're doing here is addressing the issue that people don't know what they don't know. And as soon as you start addressing that issue, then the business benefit comes back to be shortening the time to competence. But again, it's a difficult one to measure and difficult one to see. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very conscious of time. There's a great benefit in being able to hear from and talk to someone who's actually done it. And I'd like to thank Jane very much for being that person today. Jane, thank you.
Thank you.